We'll now turn the time directly over. We've already done the introduction for Dr. Samuel Zinner, so we'll now hear from Dr. Zinner.
I want to thank Jeff for facilitating this. Especially comes at the right time here in Italy. Shabbos, or the Sabbath, is over, so I'm free to address you here over the internet. I feel challenged for several reasons. One is, especially at night, my English isn't as fluent as it used to be. Also, it's very difficult to follow someone like Dan because of the depth of his insight and wisdom, but also his ability to make people laugh, which I've never been able to do. But I will say, one of my friends asked me the other day, I said, why are you speaking to Mormons? I said, well, Rabbi Jacob Neusner, blessed memory, did that. So I figure it's probably, a good thing to emulate, a good praxis to emulate. So here I am. I'm going to give a brief survey. So I'm going to try to run through these topics, starting with esoteric traditions about Abraham in the Rabbinic literature and in the Kabbalah. All of these points I'm going to address are going to be brief. First one I want to point out to you has to do with Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, which starts off in English, right? These are the generations of the heaven and earth when they were created. All right, so this term in Hebrew, when they were created, is Behib Ra'am. Right? So in Genesis Rabbah 12:9, I just pointed out that if you just switch around the letters a little bit, you'll get Abraham, that is for the sake of Abraham, or with Abraham. So these are the generations of the heaven and the earth when they were created with Abraham, or for the sake of Abraham. And the Zohar, which is probably still the most important Kabbalistic text, in the first book, folio 4a, points out that you could also read that Behi Aram as with, right? The letter Hey, fifth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, with the letter Hey, were they created. That is, God created the heavens and the earth with the letter Hey. That's the Hey of Abraham, or Abraham, which is also the Hey of the sacred Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God. Right? Another very important trope is that of Abraham as the primordial foundation stone. Right? So long ago, it was Massingberd Ford, who showed in a paper that a passage in Yalkut, which is a rabbinic anthology that dates to the time of roughly the Renaissance, I would say, but it's containing much older materials, that in the Yalkut, 766, right, there's a parable about Abraham as the primordial rock, right, upon which God builds the worlds. She points out this seems to be an inspiration behind Matthew 16's Peter the rock, but be that as it may, the parable is this: parable of a king who wanted to build and was digging down and trying to lay a foundation, but found only swamp. When at length in one place he found a Petra underneath, he said, "Here I will build." And he laid a foundation and built. So when the Holy One wanted to create the world, he passed over the generations of Enoch and of the flood as unsound. But when he saw Abraham, he was going to arise, he said, "Lo, I have discovered a Petra to build and to found the world upon." Therefore he called Abraham Tsur, that's rock or crag, right? As it is said in Isaiah 51:1, "Look unto the rock whence you were hewn." Petra being the in Aramaic, right? It's a loan word from the Greek, Petros, which doesn't mean a little stone, but a crag. And so Abraham is the foundation stone. It's a very important trope in Rabbinic Judaism. Now, the evidence in the Shepherd of Hermas, can't give the details because of time constraints, but the evidence in the Shepherd of Hermas indicates that this parable in Yalkut is ancient and not a medieval response to Matthew 16 or the Hermas for that matter. I mention that because there are a few scholars who've made that argument. Now, the next point I want to touch upon, Dan did, right? In the Qur'an, right, there is this story about Abraham and the sun and the moon and the stars setting, and this is the way he figures out, right, that these are not gods, but they've been created by God. So this, right, is an echo, right, of a story in Genesis Rabbah 33:11. Right? And so many of these traditions about Abraham that Dan read from the Quran, in fact, are echoes, right, of Jewish traditions. And this story, right, that Dan read about the sun, moon, and stars, right, we can see that it already existed, right, in Jubilees, the Book of Jubilees, Josephus, Noah, and the Apocalypse of Abraham also echoes this in chapter 7. And this, right, in the sixth surah, ayat, or verses 74 through 79, contains, I think, the most interesting version of that story. Remember when Abraham said to his father, and this is my translation from my unpublished Quran translation. Remember when Abraham said to his father, "Do you take statues for gods? Surely I perceive that you and your people are blatantly in error. And thus did you show to Abraham the kingdom of the heavens and the earth, that he might become one of those who are certain. So when the night overshadowed him, he saw a star, and he said, 'This is my Lord.' So when it set, he said, 'I do not love what sets.'" Anyway, so you've already heard that story. But the interesting thing about this is that David Flusser argued that, in fact, this Jewish story, the basis of it, this Jewish midrash, right, actually is derived somehow from one of the Hindu Upanishads. Right? And if you want the references, David Flusser, Abraham and the Upanishads, which was published in the journal Emmanuel in 1986. And he posits that there was a Persian intermediary. That's how this Hindu passage from the Upanishads, right, reached Judaism, reached Jews. But what's interesting about that is that the Sufis, these mystics in Islam, say that, well, Abraham was a prophet. Therefore, he could not have been mistaken, right, when he called the sun, the moon, and the stars God, right? They say because being a prophet, he's infallible, and so after all, God's presence, right, is everywhere, right? So it's a mystical idea that sort of you see a transition from monotheism to monism, right? God is one to that all things are one, and God dwells in all. God is all in all, right? Or God is all, to use phrases from the Jewish and Christian scriptures. And so it's interesting that the Sufi interpretation ends up coinciding, right, with the Upanishadic philosophy or mysticism, right, which is, as I said, basically monistic. All right, on to Genesis 25:6, right, and here we find that Abraham, it says, unto the sons of the concubines that Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts. Right? And he sent them away from Isaac his son while he yet lived eastward unto the east country. Now Rashi in his commentary on this verse points points out that this basically, right, is the basis of this belief that Abraham gave gifts, right, to the line of Ishmael. And this is developed in Jewish sources with the idea that these gifts were gifts of prophecy, some kind of prophecy. And it's interesting, in a recent talk, Rabbi Jeremy England reconstructs a model beginning there in Genesis 25:6, which has a long tradition in Jewish commentary, in which Moses' power of prophecy was somehow derived from his contact with and his marrying into the Arabian people of Midian. Right, so Rabbi England is suggesting that Moses was heir to the divinatory-like powers of prophecy originally taught, right, to Genesis 25:6's sons of the concubines that Abraham had. Now, the best clue we have to what this type of prophetic divination might have been like are the high priestly Urim and Thummim and the Ephod. Edward Robertson proposed that these comprised a divinatory system involving the random casting or selection of individual letters of the Hebrew alphabet, right, inscribed on stones. And he adds the following: as the basis of the Hebrew language, as the basis of the Hebrew language is the triliteral root, it follows that any three letters could provide meaningful words from which the high priest could exact or extract a message. Robertson reminds us that the terms Urim and Thummim are the plural forms of Ur and Tum, light and perfection, which begin respectively with the first and last letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So together, the two terms could function as a reference to, or even a title of the whole alphabet from Aleph to Tav. So if Genesis 25:6 in the Jewish exegesis implies some form of prophetic divinatory ritual in employing the casting or selection of individual letters of the alphabet, then we can arrive at the mysterious disconnected letters in the Qur'an. And what are those? They begin 29 of the 114 chapters or surahs of the Qur'an. Right? So Surah 2, right, starts off Aleph, Lam, Mim, 3 letters, right, of the Hebrew alphabet. And there's the endless debate, what are these disconnected letters? Right? Well, the Qur'an actually tells us, right? For instance, Quran 42:1, Ha, Mim, right? Ain, Sin, Qaf. So we have 5 letters. And then it says Kadalika, which is, that is the way, right? He inspired you and those who were before you. Right? So it's by these disconnected letters that God inspires the prophets. Similarly, in Quran 31:1, Aleph Lam Mim, Tilka ayatu al-katabe. Those are the letters. It's usually translated, those are the signs, but this is, I can't give you all the details, right, but for this argumentation, but there's more than one recent publication on this point, right? The ayah, the Arabic ayah, which is usually rendered sign, right, could very well bear the meaning of the cognate in Syriac and in Hebrew. So those are the letters of the book, the wise. And so what we have here is that these mysterious letters are sort of intermediate between the wordless heavenly revelation, or heavenly mother of the book, as the Quran calls it, and the full syntactic semantic speech. Right? So it's this intermediate. Some people have compared these disconnected letters to glossolalia, not too far off the mark, but it's that intermediate form between the wordless and then the fully syntactic and semantic levels. And I have sort of an esoteric phrase, a point here, right? This phrase, Tilka ayatu al-katabi, those are the letters, occurs several times in the Quran. But if you extract the third word is katab which is spelled KTB. That's kaf, ta, ba. Now, if you extract the final letter of each of those three words, tilka, ayat, tu, katabi, you will get an anagram for katab, right? So these disconnected letters actually, right, have the seed of the fully semantic, right, the potentiality there. All right, so on to another point here. It's Keith Yoder, a friend and colleague, shared this with me, that according to Bauckham, Richard Bauckham, who depends on Mencken at this point, the Johannine prologue, the beginning of the Gospel of John, contains 496 syllables. The epilogue, which is chapter 21, verses 1 through 23, contains 496 words. So the significance of that, of course, is that monogenes, right, only begotten, right, this very important word for the Gospel of John has a numerical value, right, of 496. But what Bauckham and Mencken probably also overlooked is that this number of 496 is curious because it's exactly double of the Hebrew numerical value for the name of Abraham, right? Remember, Avram, right, his numerical value of 243, and then when his name was changed, the He was added, knocks it on up to 248. Now in John 1, the 243rd word, according to the Nestle Ireland 28th edition, right, is verse 13's theos, from the phrase monogenes theos, the only begotten God. Now the 248th word is the same verse as kolpan, from kolpas, referring to the Father's bosom. Right, so these word counts agree with as I said, the numerical values for Avram and Avraham, 243, 248. Now you see, so why does John allude to both Avram and Abraham in this very esoteric way? Because the promise of Isaac's birth marks the transition from the name Avram to the name Abraham. It's in Genesis 17:5. And in John 1, God and the only begotten Son correspond typologically to Father Abraham and his only begotten son, Isaac. Right. There's a similar numerical play on the numerical value of the name Abraham, actually in the Qur'an, in Surah 2, verses 257 through 259. I'm not going to give as much detail as I have written down here, only to point out that there's a play going on between the Hebrew and the Arabic versions of the name of Abraham in that passage. I'll go on to something that's a little less esoteric, and that is that I'll point out Keith Yoder, my friend and colleague, in 2019 published an essay in the bosom of Abraham in the Novum Testamentum journal, and there he rehabilitates the theory that Lazarus, and in Luke's parable of the rich man and Lazarus is a cryptic allusion to Eliezer, the servant of Abraham. Right? And in the Quran, you do have at least three that I'm aware of, three passages that echo Luke's parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And I'll point out that in Quran, Surah 6, ayah or verse 74, which Dan had read, where it calls the father of Abraham Azar instead of Terah, Azar. This Azar plays off Abraham's servant's name, Eleazar, right? And relatively soon after that verse is followed by an echo of Luke's rich man and Lazarus parable. This is something that the Quran does quite a bit, actually, plays with names. And usually Western scholars end up saying, well, this is just exhibiting, this is the ignorance of the Qur'an. It doesn't even get the names correct. Well, something much more subtle and interesting is going on. Not mistakes, but plays on names. So Azar, the father of Abraham, this is a name, is more symbolic. That's pointing to, hinting at Abraham's servant Eleazar. Say, okay, now finally, in Quran Surah 2, he pointed out that there's those three verses that mention Abraham. There's one of those verses mentioned 3 times, which is unique in the Quran, right? But Abdullah Galadari, a good colleague, has pointed out that Surah 2, verse 259's anonymous retelling of the story of Abimelech's miraculous sleep, which according to Jewish traditions lasted approximately 70 years, which is the length of the Babylonian exile, is lengthened to 100 years in Ayah or verse 259. Galadari emphasizes that verse 259 is part of a discussion between God and Abraham on the theme of the resurrection of the dead, which of course is a symbol for national revival after the Babylonian exile. That's a topic appearing explicitly, the resurrection of the dead, appearing explicitly in the immediately preceding and following verses 258 and 260, both of which mention the name of Abraham. Galadari next reminds us that Paul in Romans 4:19 likens Abraham to a dead person because his age of 100 years was as to nature, too advanced to produce children. So what Quran Surah 2 verse 259 does is to substitute Abimelech's 70 years of miraculous sleep with Abraham's age of 100 years, the age when he miraculously produced a son. So again, it's not a mistake. It's an intentional symbolic move, right? That's going on. And so that's, I could go on, but I think those are the high points of my paper that I think that the audience here will be interested in.